This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we'll bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that we like to call Israel Behind the Headlines, delving deep into and unpacking issues underlying our lives here in Israel. My guest today teaches at Bar Ilan University's Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry. He specializes in ultra-Orthodox society in Israel, and his latest book is an edited volume, together with Nissim Leon, entitled Contemporary Israeli Haredi Society, Profiles, Trends and Challenges, forthcoming in English by Routledge. Professor Kimi Kaplan, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
So the rebirth of the Jewish people from the end of the Second World War until today has been extensively celebrated, and it seems that out of all the sectors of the Jewish people, those who can celebrate the most are the Haredim. From near annihilation in the Holocaust and serious predictions about their disappearance in its aftermath, it seems that Haredi society is at its peak right now, demographically, politically, even economically to a certain extent. Do you share this assessment?
Yes, certainly if we look back, if we would look at Haredi society going back to the 40s, they're basically challenged twice within 3 years. The first is obviously, as you mentioned, the results of the Holocaust, which are catastrophic and shared with all the rest of the Jewish people. And with them raises a whole set of theological issues, institutional, organizational, the whole bit. And 3 years later, lo and behold, appears the State of Israel. And that's another theological challenge. And way beyond that, for those who are living in Israel, a very practical challenge because Haredi leaders believe or feel that the secular national state of Israel established now might not be a place that a observant Jew as such will be able to live his daily life within it as easy as it goes. They're worried about Sabbath. They're worried about education of the children. They're worried about dietary laws, and so forth. Very basic issues for an observant Jew, certainly Orthodox. And this is all caving in on them from many different directions. And again, also the Zionist state is a theological issue. It's a challenge because in their worldview, God runs history. So if God was, we'll put it in a phrase, if God was in Auschwitz and God established the State of Israel and he was in Tel Aviv on the 15th of May or 14th of May, 1948, where are we? Because he's running history. And we've been opposing the Zionist movement for decades. And here we are. He's with the other side. So we've got a very big, it's a very delicate junction here of, as you said, with a very clear prediction that within 20, 30 years, they might not be here anymore.
Yeah, and going after 1945 and 1948, they've been able to negotiate their existence vis-a-vis the State of Israel and in general, very well.
Very well, and I think there is, to the extent that I think there's one explanation that holds. Otherwise, it's inconceivable. The only explanation is that they have succeeded way beyond what they expected or thought to engrave in Jewish society the notion that they are the last Mohicans, the only authentic representation of traditional Judaism on earth. All the rest, all other manifestations of Judaism on earth are mutations, late developments, whatever they are, they're not authentic. And they are the only authentic ones. Now, you may like the authentic, or you may not like the authentic, but it is the authentic. Again, arguably. Historians refute this. It's not the case at all. But in the public square, I think that's the only thing that explains why David Ben-Gurion at the time made very serious gestures to Haredi society.
On all these issues that concern them, be it integration into the broader Israeli society, dietary laws, Sabbath.
And way beyond that, there was money. I mean, keep in mind that between 1952 and 1977, Haredi political representatives are in the opposition. They're not in the coalition. They're not around the government table. And you are removed from financial support that you would get being a government member or a coalition member. They're not there, but they're still getting support from behind the scenes in many different ways. And I think the only explanation is this self-image which caught, and I think still exists in Israeli society to a broad extent, of the authentic Jew.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, bearing in mind the way that Haredi political leaders are carrying themselves currently with relation to political power. This is perhaps, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, the one single most impressive evolution or mutation of the Haredi self-perception, the way that their attitude towards political power.
Well, yes and no. Because if we go back to Poland, for instance, pre-war Poland, there were Haredi representatives in the Polish Sejm, which is the equivalent of the Knesset, the parliament. So in Galicia, Haredi leaders, late 19th century, early 20th century, were involved in state politics in the front or behind the scenes in various different ways. In the U.S., likewise, again, more behind the scenes. So the notion of being involved in the general political scene of the country or the empire or whatever it is where I'm living in is not new. I think that here, over the years, there is something, again, there's something to do with this authenticity that enabled the Haredi politicians to gain maybe more power than their actual power and more influence than their actual relative influence you would consider to be reasonable, again, given their, the margins of their vote.
Yeah, but this involvement can be divided into two things. Well, in Poland, as you say, and even in the first decades of the State of Israel, this political involvement perhaps was more focused on, guarding their own interests and establishing some sort of cultural and political autonomy for them. And there has been this sea change in terms of how they perceive the broader Israeli state. And I'd like to ask you, one of the issues that you tackle in the book is the growth or perhaps the emergence of Sephardic Haredi existence. I mean, the Mizrahi, and which had some, of course, it was a major demographic factor, right? This broadening of the lines quite considerably in the 1970s. And that coincided with that moment that the Haredis had this, reconsideration of their political power. Are these? Is it just a coincidence, or are these really complementary issues?
Not at all. You hit it on the head. It's a very interesting junction in the sense that, indeed, up until the 70s, the Haredi representatives, which were from European origin, what we call Ashkenazim, were very sectorial in their political conduct. And they were basically trying to deal with who they're representing and trying to guard their interests and get as much for their population and not deal with the rest, again, aside from a few very specific cases. Along came the Sephardi Haredi development, which is a social cultural development, which led in the early 1980s to a political party. And
Shas.
Shas, exactly, known until today as Shas. By the way, there was one ethnic party at the establishment of State of Israel, which represented the Yemenites. It disappeared within one Knesset. Since then, the next one which showed up was Shas, and against all odds, it's around for about 40 years.
I'll take you up on this against all odds in a second, but finish your thought.
What happened with Shas was Shas challenged not only Israeli society in many ways, but also the internal Haredi politics, because Shas representatives were willing to take part in the Israeli general political effort and be ministers of government offices, which by definition have to deal with all spectrum of Israeli society, and not only with their own, electorate. And that was a major change. And that's something the Ashkenazi Haredim found hard to deal with. They caved in over time, and today they are in a very different place. And in that sense, you're very, very correct. I'll just give you one anecdote, if I may. 1991, the Gulf War, missiles, I think it's mid-January 91, several missiles were shot from Iraq to Israel. And people here were with masks. It was very tough moment for many people in many ways. And Israel had a very serious deliberation. Should we respond to this or not? And if so, how? Militarily, of course. And there was a meeting of cabinet, which included ministers and included army seniors and whoever else sits in the room at the time. And there was walking into the room, there's a very clear notion of we should retaliate. I mean, we cannot, if we sit quiet, that's a message which will bring us more missiles. And at some point in the discussion in the room, Aryeh Deri, who is a representative of Shas, asked the army seniors and whoever else, the professionals, several questions. They responded, and he said, it's clear from what they're saying that we should not do anything. And that swayed the atmosphere in the room. Now, this comes from a Haredi representative. He's not an experienced army, general, officer, let alone anything. Someone who just asked the right questions and said, listen to the professionals. I think, this is the answer. And indeed, that's what happened. Israel did not respond militarily.
So basically what you're saying, this anecdote serves to highlight the great influence that Haredi parties have on public life in Israel and on government affairs.
Indeed, and I think that if someone here would come from Mars or anywhere else and you would show him a photo of government ministers in Israel at any given moment from certainly the 1980s onward until today, and I mean, the person would recognize without knowing anything. He would just see a few people who were sort of black hats, as they say, dressed differently, different dress code than all the others. He or she would probably ask, "Who are these? What are they?" And he or she would probably say, "They must be very powerful because the amount of people that they are, the amount of offices they're holding, and the number of people here in the government." This is a serious component.
So why did you say that it's against all odds, that Shas survives and prospered? I mean, right now it's the second largest party in government, and I think third or fourth in the Knesset?
Because, the question is, what are we comparing with? If I'm looking back to 48, if in 1948, or for that sake, 1955, or even 1960, you would take Haredi representatives in the Knesset and tell them, in 40 years, you're going to be ministers. You'll be a very strong force in the Israeli political scene. They would probably look at you and send you to a loony bin. No one foresaw that situation at all. No one foresaw the demographic growth. No one foresaw the resurgence of Haredi society in so many ways. And again, I can understand why it would sound very weird at the time. So in that sense, I think that's the way that's how I would look at it to compare.
You also write in the book that Haredi is a quote-unquote family name rather than a first name, meaning that it's, there are plenty of internal divisions that are perhaps invisible to from the outside. But one thing that you do write that is common to all of them is the feeling of existential threat and the fact that they are always on the defensive. And, having spoken about the great development that they've made in terms of political power and their relationship with the broader Israeli public, has this been dimmed in any way, or is it still a driving force for the, Haredi perception of themselves?
It's very interesting. You're hitting a very strong paradox. The paradox is that this notion of being on the defense and being threatened all the time is 200 years old. It goes back to the inception of Orthodoxy in the late 18th, early 19th century. And this...
Because just to explain, the whole idea of setting the Orthodoxy was to, after the walls of the ghettos were brought down, to build metaphorical walls of the ghetto.
Well,
right?
exactly, because the drop of the walls, as you marked it, of what we call Jewish traditional society, opened the door to the appearance of many different Judaisms. Enlightenment movement, reform movement, secularism, forms of socialism, communism, later on conservative movement, Zionism, you name it. And what happened is that within 100 years, again, according to the Haredi perception of history, I want to stress the threat as far as they perceive it. Up until the late 18th century, 100% of Jews were Haredi. And within 100 years, it shrunk to 10%. 90% left the folds and went elsewhere. Now, this is inaccurate. Historically, this is inaccurate or wrong. But that doesn't really matter because that's the way they perceive reality and history, and that's the way they will respond to it. So when and this is the sense of threat. And add that to the authenticity in the sense that if we disappear, and within 100 years, 90% disappeared, again, according to that perception, if we disappear, Judaism disappears because all the rest are not authentic Jews. So it's a very strong notion that is passed on from generation to generation for close to 200 years. Now, until today. Now, you rightly so say logically, well, friends, you're not there anymore. You're strong, you're settled, you're demographically growing, you're politically strong, economically, the whole bit. But no, it's so engraved. And I think that until today, if you look at Haredi, or you hear rather, Haredi representatives talking in the Knesset on the podium, I barely will find someone speaking without mentioning some kind of a threat that's out there to...
without being passive-aggressive.
Well, yes. But I think, again, if I look at it in perspective, it became so strong, this notion, that it's hard to think of them as being able to exist without having some threat that I have to deal with, right or wrong.
Yeah. So, a lot has been discussed mainly recently in light of the current government and the state budget that is about to pass very soon, in which it is really a bonanza for the Haredim. In terms of handouts and budgets, it's almost unprecedented. Their demands and the fact that they were met by the ruling coalition and the Likud Prime Minister. Now, looking at this very brazen politics, and they, of course, are deflecting all sorts of criticism, be it as anti-Semitism or whatever. And I would like to ask you whether this brazen politics of really taking as much as they can get without, while cancelling everything else as white noise, is this a testament to their power or to their weakness?
Well, I wish to flip the cards. I think that a lot of the discourse in Israeli society points at them being greedy, taking whatever terms people would use in the public discourse, and worse, obviously, than greedy. I think the question has to be posed to the majority, not to the minority. The question should be, why is, in this case, Benjamin Netanyahu or others before him are being so generous in giving them so much? For what reason? Now, politically, if there's no option, you can buy for less. You don't have to pay more. You can pay less they will be with you because they have no option, and the option means not having the resources or accessibility to resources. The question has to be posed to the majority. And this is a question, and again, to my mind, if I think about it and I go back to various governments over the last 40 years, since 1977, since Menachem Begin took over the government from the Labour Party since the inception of the state, basically, then one asks himself, what is it that brings the majority to cave in time and again, not only on issues of budget, on other issues as well, and just give it in? For what reason? And in this sense, I really think that the question should not be posed to the one who wants; it's the one who's giving.
No, but some of the responsibility does lie. The responsibility does lie with the Haredi leadership, in the sense that the previous government, that wasn't a Likud-led government, the first in however many years. Even though the majority was courting them enthusiastically and did want to give them everything that Likud is now giving them, and perhaps even more, they turned them down. There was some sort of strategic alliance between them and Likud, and that must have a reason.
So the strategic alliance is, again, to my understanding, is the fact that Haredi society as a society, since the 1990s, has gradually become very associated overall with right-wing in Israeli political terms. And that's where they find themselves. This was not the case in the 60s and 70s. They were in a very different setup, and they coalesced with others.
Up to the 90s.
I would say a bit earlier. Again, up to the 90s, it was sort of shaky in the sense that it went once here and once there. But the populace from the grassroots has become much more right-wing. And it makes it for their representatives much harder, even if they wanted to associate with a government that is not on that side of the political scene of Israel. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think a lot of very practical local political assessments of how strong the government will be, how long will it last, is it going to but again, that's pure politics. You can gamble, you win, you lose, you lose. In this case, they probably won more than they lost. Now, keep in mind another thing. It's true they're not in the government when we had the Bennett-Lapid government, right? They were not in the coalition. But a lot of state budget goes and passes through no matter who is in the government, because it's engraved in the government offices' budgets. So they are funneled to whoever the address might be, no matter who is in the government. So it's not 100. It's not a 0 vis-a-vis 100. It's somewhere in the middle. So that's another sort of a balancing sheet there.
Yeah. I want to go back to the first point that you meant about the rightward shift of the Haredi populace that trickles up to the politics. I mean, they probably, had some ethno-nationalist inclinations before, but right now it's really become a sort of a flagship of the Haredi politics. And talk to you about demographics. Because, looking at it from a liberal perspective, the future of a liberal Israel with the Haredim lumped together with the illiberal right so strongly gives rise to many gloom and doom predictions about where this country is going. But at the same time, if you look at the Haredi demographics, for years and years, the birth rates have far exceeded those of average Jewish households, yet their expansion has not necessarily been proportional. I mean, certainly not so much in terms of numbers, but in terms of political power and the seats in parliament that have been more or less stable for 2 or 3 decades now. Mm-hmm. How do you account for all this?
So once again, you're at the right point. Haredi society it's expanding. In the last 20 years, less than what we thought initially, or less than what the certain projections, primarily because women are joined the workforce in massive numbers. And in any Western society, women joining the workforce brings about a decline in the number of children in the family. Nothing new, and they're not exceptional in that. And that happens also there. But set that aside. You're right in the sense that we've got a huge question here. If you would just calculate the demographics and add it to the mandates, the political vote, then the Haredi parties should have been much bigger than what they are. I'm not talking about Shas because Shas has a strong vote of people who are not Haredi, and most of their voters are not Haredi, so Shas is not the example. But the Ashkenazi Haredi parties, Agudat Yisrael, Degel HaTorah, Yadut HaTorah, and all their forms back and forth.
And that is interesting. Sorry to interrupt
Sure.
for just a second, because in the terms of the number of seats in parliament that Shas has, there have been fluctuations, and United Torah Judaism not so much.
You're right. So the question is, so where are the votes? There are more people voting. Where are the votes? So we do know for a fact that there are growing numbers. We don't know the numbers. It's tough to figure it out. But there are growing numbers of Haredim over the years who don't vote for Haredi parties. They vote for Likud, or they'll vote for Ben Gvir, or whoever. Again, over time, it's clearly more. We don't have the numbers, but again, this would explain part of this discrepancy that we're seeing.
So it doesn't account for a dropout from the community.
It's not
people going
no. It's
secular.
No. That's the whole point. It's not dropout from the community. Dropout from the community is marginal, just as joining the community is marginal. I mean, if you set aside all the rhetoric in Israeli society about repentance and, on the one hand, and dreams of people that Haredim are going to leave the folds en masse, on the other hand, so far there's no evidence to either. So there are changes in Haredi society, and that's important because I'll give you one example which would explain the shift in vote of people who are not voting for Haredi parties. Again, this is where demographics and demography and geography and politics will all sort of meet together. We have several Haredi cities which are all adjacent to the Green Line, either from the east side or the west side of it, heavily populated by Haredim. Beitar Ilit, Modi'in Ilit, Elad, so forth. Now, these people are experiencing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on a daily basis, again, give or take. This has an ongoing effect. And over time, there are Haredim who say, it's more important for me to vote on this issue rather than to vote on the synagogue in my neighborhood or whatever it might be, because this is my existence, my daily existence. And if I believe that a right-wing government will indeed be more powerful, resolve the issue, I don't know, draw the Palestinians away, however you want to word it, then if that's what I think is going to happen, or if I vote for them and I strengthen them, they'll do that, then by all means, it's more important for me. So that's again, that's one trend that we seem to sort of pick up that is out there.
One of the chapters in your book is dedicated to enlistment in the IDF, in the army. That seems like, out of all the political hot potatoes, seem to be the hottest one in terms both the Haredi leadership, that they seem prepared to die on that hill, and also in terms of the backlash from the secular and liberal sectors of Israeli society, and the response of the High Court of Justice to all sorts of petitions regarding that issue. Can you unpack this issue for us and give us perhaps an assessment where all this will lead?
As an historian, I don't know what happened yesterday, so to figure out what's going to happen tomorrow is a tough call. I wouldn't dare, but I will say one thing. Up until now, from what we can gather from all we know, the number of Haredim who enlist in the army is marginal and its overall remains marginal. There are changes, but when you look at the potential, you look at the full numbers of how many are there at the age of, take it 18 to 23, 24, wherever you would like to draw the line, the numbers are completely marginal. On the one hand. On the other hand, there is a lot of militarism in the society, in the language, in the support for the army, again, in the right wing, the shift towards the right wing in political terms. So there are militaristic notions in Haredi society. So far, they are not translated into many Haredim, or much more than what we have now, enlisting in the army. The only thing that probably would do it, again, from what we know, is when there are economic straits, or there would be a tightening of the belt, which is so far not the case, certainly not in this coalition, a tightening of a belt that would basically enforce them to do that for economic reasons. Now, this happened in 2003 by the same Benjamin Netanyahu. He, as Minister of Economy, cut the national insurance allowance per child, created a 6-year program, and that was the main catalyst for Haredi women to join the workforce. So we do have a precedent for that happening in the world of Haredi women. Now, granted, the world of Haredi men is more sensitive because there's this issue of them sitting and learning, or the wish that they will sit and learn. I somehow tend to believe that given less finances, they would have to, by definition, pick and choose. Basically say, Gilad, you're not learning. You've exhausted your 1 year or 2 years in yeshiva. You've done what you can do. It's time to go your merry way. As long as they have the money, they won't do that. They don't have the money, they would have to decide.
So the solution would be a bit similar to the one of Haredi women going out to work, to have like a sort of like a guarded, autonomous units of Haredi men that, because I think that more than just not learning Torah, it's the prospect of them joining the Israeli army, the largely secular Israeli army that is an aberration to them, right? So if they'll be able to protect their interests within the larger Israeli army, that is something that they'll be able to swallow.
So yes, but here's the other side of the coin. And that, again, is less discussed. And that is apparently that the IDF is not that interested. Because of 2 reasons. One is, logistically, it's very demanding. You need to have separate units, you need to have special food, you need to supply them with whatever special religious, requirements that they have and so forth. It's a headache for the army, number one. Number 2, no less important to my mind, is the fact that overall, to date, the annual missions that the army has, the endless chart, which is on the wall somewhere not far from here in Tel Aviv, in the headquarters of the army, there's this huge chart with all the missions that we have to fulfill this year in all the units and so forth. All right, I'm imagining this chart. Now, as long as the missions are completed with the manpower that I have, what do I need more for? The day that the missions will not be fulfilled, or they will not be able to be fulfilled because it's clear that it's just not going to work, that's the day where the army will have an interest, right, to my mind.
Mm-hmm. Another issue that I'm interested in is really the difference between Israeli Haredim and the Haredim in the diaspora, because all those issues that are really affecting the Haredi way of life and Haredi politics, really the driving forces in Haredi life, whether it's the army or work and state pensions, are not really relevant for Haredi existence elsewhere. How does that really affect their own self-perception and this, communication between Haredim in Israel and abroad?
So indeed, the Haredi scene in Israel is not the rule. It's the exception of the rule. Nowhere around the world do we have a Haredi community that lives the way the community lives here, because nowhere in the world is there a government which supports the community as such in various different ways to the degree that it happens in Israel. And nowhere in the world is there a government who really would be bothered, yes, or more or less about coalition, or more or less about are they authentic Jews or not authentic Jews. It's not their issue. That's not, you're a minority within a minority, whole different ballgame. So you're absolutely right. Most of these issues do not pertain to Haredim abroad. Over 90% of Haredim, actually I think it's close to 95%, in the US, which is the second largest Haredi community in the world, in Great Britain and other places, will learn in a religious institution, a yeshiva or a kollel, in the internal language, for a few years. Within a few years, they're out because they're out to work. Or they're out to learn and work, whatever it is, get an occupation and continue with life. They will not sit and work for many years.
And then they also learn the core curriculum, which they don't in Israel.
Some yes and some no. But again, the question is how much does the country they're living in enforce it or doesn't enforce it, to what degree and whatever. But the answer is overall, of course, certainly more than what happens here. So it's altogether a very unique scene that we have here. The relationship between these Haredi communities is very interesting because of that. Because you will find this sense, on the one hand, of Haredim abroad who will look at Haredim in Israel and say, within our circles, these are the real Haredim. They are the best of the best. Because they are living the lives that we cannot live, and they are supposedly. On the other hand, you will find, I mean, it's complex. You'll find that Israeli Haredim will sometimes look down at Haredim abroad and sort of say, you're not the real thing. We are the real thing. We are battling the real battles. You're not, and so forth. And again, from a different angle, you will hear, and we do hear this more and more, Haredim abroad who are looking at Haredim Israel and saying, friends, you're on the wrong path. You're hitting the wall. And the more you hit the wall, at some point, the more damage you will cause to yourself more than anyone else, to the Haredi society.
So this is amazing because this was just my closing question that I was about to ask, and it really feeds very well into it. I mean, are they aware that this brazen politics that you say is perhaps not them to blame, it's the government itself, the majority to blame, but still, I mean, they are complicit in that sort of politics, and at least some of the responsibility lies with them. Are they aware, as the shrewd politicians that they are, and also hearing those calls from across the pond, that they might be hitting a wall, that there could be a backlash that might endanger the whole endeavor? Are they attuned to that kind of scenario?
The answer is yes, and I think that what's happening in Israel in the last few weeks is a great example. As you know, there's been the demonstrations which are going on for months, and in the last few weeks, the demonstrations, or some part of them, have taken an angle of the budget and the Haredi part in the budget and their responsibility, and it's going at the Haredim. It's not going at Netanyahu, it's going at the Haredim and saying, you're not contributing, you're not taking part in the obligations of Israeli society and the challenges of Israeli society, but you're just sitting on the money. So the answer is, I think that if you look in the last few weeks, there was suddenly, after a lot of several Haredi representatives who were out there speaking in favor of changes in the legal system and so forth, they went behind, they went under, they went down and under. They disappeared. They disappeared because they understood that this is getting into their backyard or into their front yard in Bnei Brak, in Jerusalem, in several other places where people went into Haredi neighborhoods and said, we're here, we're protesting in your front garden. So this, I think when this happens, their representatives, not the first time. I think this is maybe the strongest one, a powerful one. But when this happened in previous times, their representatives disappeared under the table for a while and let that wave as if sort of pass or hope that it'll pass. And when it passes, they come out and then so the rhetoric comes back. So are they tuned? Absolutely. Are they shrewd? Absolutely. I think that statistically, their assumption is that what worked until today is that once in a while there's a wave. It's tough. It's not, you're on the defensive or you disappear. But at the end of the day, things work out well for us. So if it worked up until now, statistics are in our favor. I don't know if that's going to be the case, but that's the assumption.
All right, Professor Kimi Kaplan, Professor of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at Bar-Ilan University and co-editor of the forthcoming Contemporary Israeli Haredi Society Profiles, Trends and Challenges. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for your time.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and many thanks to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their support. And now we've got a request because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app, and we'd like to ask you to please write us a review of any kind, good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has almost 1,000 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.